Israelis paused to the sound of a lamenting single-tone siren across the country, marking the Holocaust Remembrance Day in commemoration of the 6 million Jews killed by the Nazis during the Second World War. Motorists paused by their vehicles on the main highway leading to Jerusalem as sirens wailed across Israel for 2 minutes in memory of the victims. The annual Holocaust Remembrance Day is one of the most solemn days on Israel's national calendar. And in a touching tribute, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Reuven Rivlin attended a wreath-laying ceremony at Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum. This year's memorial took place across the country, in contrast to last year when coronavirus restrictions forced most ceremonies to be held online. The country of 9 million people has since administered 2 shots of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine to more than half of its population. To date, Israel has recorded 835,385 coronavirus cases and 6,270 deaths. US President Joe Biden's administration plans to provide $235 million of aid to Palestinians, restoring part of the assistance cut by former President Donald Trump. 2/3 will go to the United Nations agency that supports Palestinian refugees, which has faced a dire financial situation since it lost $360 million of US funding in 2018.
U.S. foreign assistance for the Palestinians serves important U.S. interests and values.
The aid will flow primarily to the United Nations Relief Works Agency, or UNRWA, which provides schools, food, and shelter to Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Speaking to Reuters in the Jordanian capital, the head of UNRWA on Wednesday said the funds couldn't come soon enough.
The situation has been absolutely terrible, and there was a feeling of abandonment from the international community.
The package is part of an effort to repair U.S. ties with the Palestinians that all but collapsed during Trump's tenure. The Trump administration blocked nearly all aid after it severed ties with the Palestinian Authority in 2018. That move was widely seen as an attempt to force the Palestinians to negotiate with Israel on terms the Palestinian leadership said would deny them a viable state. Biden's aides have also signaled that they want to reestablish the goal of a negotiated 2-state solution as a priority in U.S. policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
The United States is committed to advancing prosperity, security, and freedom for both Israelis and Palestinians in tangible ways in the immediate term, which is important in its own right, of course, but also as a means to advance towards a negotiated 2-state solution.
But they have moved cautiously so far, and any major steps are likely to wait for the dust to clear after Israel's inconclusive March election, which will be followed by Palestinian elections scheduled in coming months.
Meanwhile, Israel's ambassador to the United States and the United Nations has criticized the renewal of funding to the UN agency supporting refugees, UNRWA. Gilad Erdan said that it allowed anti-Israel incitement and anti-Semitic activity in its facilities.
Israel is strongly opposed to the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic activity happening in UNRWA's facilities. We believe that this UN agency for so-called refugees should not exist in its current format. UNRWA schools regularly use materials that incite against Israel, and the twisted definition used by the agency to determine who is a refugee only perpetuates the conflict. In conversations with the US State Department, I have expressed my disappointment and objection to the decision to renew UNRWA's funding without first ensuring that certain reforms, including stopping the incitement and removing anti-Semitic content from its educational curriculum, are carried out. UNRWA is an organization that engaged in political advocacy and enables incitement to violence. Therefore, it should not exist in its current form.
Muhammed Desai is the director of the lobby group Africa for Palestine. He joins us now on Zoom for more. Muhammed, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you again. So, does UNRWA have anti-Semitic content on its education curriculum?
Hi, Peter. It's quite laughable that the usual excuse that Israeli lobbyists and advocates will use is the anti-Semitism card. However, that card is becoming old. It's becoming quite unnecessary, especially now that the UNRWA agency, various other UN bodies have come out very clearly, in fact, in the last 1 week now, to make clear that UNRWA's purpose is to provide food, is to provide education, to provide electricity, and other basic services to the over more than 5 million Palestinian refugees. We're talking about refugees who literally have the keys to their homes, who can see their former houses, but are not allowed to re-enter their former homeland because of Israel's apartheid and discriminatory policies. Us as Africa for Palestine join other peace-loving peoples of the world in welcoming today's decision by the United States to resume its funding of UNRWA and of various other UN agencies in support of the Palestinian people.
Give us a sense of just how devastating this loss of income had been since Donald Trump pulled the plug. How did it affect ordinary Palestinians to have this aid removed?
Well, we're talking of, for example, the Gaza Strip, which is one of the most densely populated pieces of land on this earth. Here you have over 1.5 million people living in one of the most concentrated areas who are completely cut off from the international community, from global services. The Israeli authorities have, in fact, calculated the exact number of calories that will keep a human being alive and only allow that amount of food into that area. It's an entire and complete strangulation in which the Palestinian refugees face, both in the Gaza Strip, but also in the other areas in which they are stateless peoples. And thus, the COVID pandemic has obviously aggravated the situation that Palestinian refugees had found themselves in, a situation in which not only did they not have food in their stomachs, but also they are also living in conditions in which their very dignity was being robbed from them. But I think that we as solidarity activists do take our hats off to the Palestinian people who are refusing to die on their knees and are insisting to fight on their feet. Thus, we welcome the various forms of support that come to the Palestinian people, one of which is such humanitarian assistance. However, such assistance should never be a form of bribery. It should never be a form of coercion. At the end of the day, the Palestinians are not suffering because of a tsunami or because of a natural disaster. They are suffering because of a man-made Israeli occupation. And so, thus, whilst we're welcoming the humanitarian assistance, those of us that are forming part of the solidarity movement worldwide will continue to put pressure on Israel to lift its embargo on the Palestinian people, but also to allow the refugees, the largest refugee population in the world, to be allowed back into their former homes.
All right, so very positive impact in terms of the humanitarian and social realities on the ground. But let's talk a little bit about the political considerations. Does this resumption of aid reset the relationship between the US and Palestine?
I think that what we are seeing is a slightly more progressive policies being put in place by the Biden administration. We see, for example, the lifting of sanctions against the International Criminal Court. We know that the Palestinians have now taken their struggle to such international bodies, such as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. So these are welcomed moves by the U.S. administration. However, we do feel that the Biden administration is still part of the larger U.S. system that supplies, on the one hand, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which takes care of Palestinian refugees, with just about 150 to 230 million dollars. But at the same time, the United States supplies the Israeli government with more than $3 billion in military expenditure. And so there is still a necessary conversation to be had within the USA and amongst policy makers regarding that unfettered support to the Israeli regime. I think I concur with you, Peter, that however, that there is positive energy, but this is not a mistake. I think that the positive energy has come because of the hard work, not just of activists on the ground, but also because of some of the progressive Congress people that we see. For example, from Alexander Cortez through to Rashida Tlaib and Bernie Sanders and others that are beginning to find a voice within the U.S. establishment because of the support that comes to them from the ground. So I do think that we are beginning to see moves in the United States that's becoming more progressive in terms of the issue of Israel and Palestine. And this is most definitely because of larger changes that are taking place within civil society and within the public. For example, we know that some of the biggest supporters of the Palestinian cause today in the United States are young Jewish students who are refusing to identify with the Israeli regime. So all around, there are positive changes that we hope will alleviate the suffering of the oppressive nature in which the Palestinians find themselves.
I think you might have partly answered my next question, and that is, the reality is that the United States always is and probably always will be a friend to Israel, and that Biden perhaps is trying to be the good guy to both, but by and large, I would guess that Israel gets the lion's share of that friendliness.
Well, we had a similar situation when it came to apartheid South Africa, where the U.S. administration successively were always in support of the apartheid regime, but it was the will of the peoples, both globally speaking, but also on the streets of New York and of Chicago, of Washington, D.C., in California and elsewhere, that ultimately forced the U.S. administration to take a more progressive position and ultimately to impose certain forms of sanctions on the apartheid South African regime. And we have a similar situation in Israel, where you have a U.S. administration, whether it's under Biden, whether it's under Obama or Trump, that does have a bias towards the Israeli regime. But we are seeing massive shifts within U.S. public opinion, and we hope that this year will then translate into a U.S. government policy that sees less of a bias towards the Israeli regime and a greater bias towards finding a proper solution for the peoples of Israel and Palestine.
We heard the Israeli ambassador to the United States and the UN speaking just now. Is there anything that Israel is likely to do as a consequence of this resumption of aid, or it's just more words than anything else?
Well, other than using the anti-Semitism card, they have threatened to make the life of the Palestinian people more difficult. I mean, this is something that we see when certain decisions are taken by the Palestinian Authority or by the Palestinian political leadership, that you see mass arrests, you see incarceration of Palestinian political leaders. However, I think that the Palestinians have not only become used to this, but they've also found ways in which these things don't affect the larger struggle for dignity, for a life without oppression.
What do you think might happen now going forwards as Joe Biden is trying to fix this relationship with Palestine? Are you hopeful that this might lead to more concrete discussions in terms of finding a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian question?
Well, it is interesting that when the Palestinians welcomed today's decision, I mean, here I'm talking about the Prime Minister, for example, of the Palestinian Authority, it was on one hand welcoming the humanitarian assistance, but on the other hand insisting that the USA should form part of a more just, of a more reasonable position when it comes to Israel and Palestine, which includes an appreciation of international law. We feel, those of us in the solidarity movement, we feel that the terrain of struggle for for the Palestinian cause is really now within the legal terrain. And we feel that the Palestinians don't only have a good case, but they also have the necessary political will, both of the Palestinian population, but also of their supporters worldwide, who are in some ways have reached the end of the road of those endless negotiations, of those endless talks with the Israeli government. We hope and we are confident that legal action against the Israeli government and against Israeli military personnel that have conducted what has been termed war crimes or crimes against humanity will not only put the Israeli authorities on notice, but will also hopefully force them to the negotiating table, because the endless oppression has reached the end of the road where there are consequences and where people will be held accountable. But it's in their very interest, in the interest of the Israelis, to sit down and negotiate and to find a just solution with the Palestinian people.
All right. Muhammed Desai, we're going to have to leave it there. Always good to talk to you. Thank you so much indeed for giving us some insights into this latest move by the United States in restoring its aid towards the Palestinians. Thank you so much indeed for your time.